It's about to be that time of year when smallmouth bass start roaming up shallow, getting on isolated pieces of cover or dark spots on the bottom, and a Maribou jig and the Cindy rig come out to play. In today's video, I'm going to break down each of these two baits, how to use them, and where to be throwing the Maribou jig and Cindy rig to catch those shallow water fish. Let's dive into this thing. This is one of my favorite times of year. I get to turn off the forward-facing sonar. I get to push up into the shallow flats, looking for isolated pieces of cover, dark spots on the bottom, and high percentage areas for smallmouth bass to be hanging out up in the shallow water zones. In this one, I'm going to be picking up my Maribou jig and the Cindy rig to start targeting these fish. These are the smart smallmouth, the big ones that get up on the flats. You get to roam around, turn that trolling motor on high, cover a lot of water, and look for those fish in shallow water zones. And in today's video, I'm really looking forward to breaking down everything you need to know about throwing the Maribou jig and the Cindy rig to go out and have success this spring. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on trips, and teaching you about techniques like the Cindy rig and the Maribou jig to go out and catch big bass. If you guys enjoy that style of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and growing this community. And I'd love to know what are some of your favorite techniques when those smallmouth push up shallow and you're targeting them in shallow water zones. But without further ado, let's dive into this thing. Now, like I mentioned in the introduction of this video, this is really going to be focused on the Maribou jig and the Cindy rig for shallow water roaming smallmouth bass. There's a period of time during the spring when those fish get up on those shallow flats, and really all time of year, when they'll get up on those shallow flats and you're able to target these fish with these finesse presentations, making long casts and getting these small baits in front of these bass to trigger them to bite. Now, what we're going to start with is talking about the when. When are you going to be targeting those fish in those shallow water zones? Now, I say shallow water because shallow water could be relative. Now, I talk about it typically in less than like 10 to 12 foot of water, but if you're fishing these Great Lakes that are clear down to 30 plus foot of water, shallow might be 20 foot deep, and you need to modify some of these techniques, maybe go up in size on your weight or slow down your retrieve to sink that bait deeper in the water to get those fish's attention. But for me, what I consider shallow water is less than 12 foot of water. A lot of the places I'm fishing, that 12 foot zone or less is where these fish like to spawn or hang out pre-spawn when I'm targeting them shallow. And that's where I find these two techniques to be the most successful in less than 12 foot of water. A lot of times for me, this is a sight fishing thing. This is a visual thing. I'm targeting isolated pieces of cover or dark spots in the bottom or changes in the composition where these fish are hanging out. And in that less than 12 foot of water zone is where I really see these techniques being the most successful for me. When I start to look for these fish in those shallow water zones are really in two time periods. The first one is going to be on those really bright, sunny, warm days in the spring when that shallow water is starting to warm up quickly, especially after a warm night. When you get those warm nights, there's something that happens where that water temp, it doesn't decline overnight. It stays a consistent temperature, which allows those fish to push up and feel comfortable pushing up onto shallow flats, followed by a warm day that will continue rising that water temperature. Those fish will feel comfortable pushing up out of those shallow water zones a lot more effectively. So the first time that I'm looking for these fish in shallow water zones is after a warm night or warm evening. This is when I'm going to look for those fish to start to make a push or start to show up in those shallow water areas. The other time for me is when that water temp hits about 53 degrees and above, really 53 degrees through, pretty much all of the summer. When you get those warm water temps in the shallow water zones, these fish will get up shallow because they're looking to spawn, but really stay shallow all season long. There's always some food source for these fish in shallow water. When I find this to be the very most productive, really in that pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn period. So really 53 degrees to maybe about 72 degrees. These fish are pushed up shallow. They're getting ready to spawn. They're feeding up. They're spawning, they're hanging around their spawning areas, and then they're post-spawn feeding on the bugs and the mayfly hatch and the bait fish that are pushed up in shallow water. So those really are the two most productive times a year that I see these fish pushing up shallow, willing to eat a Maribou jig and a Cindy rig. So now that we've talked about the when and the why these fish are pushing shallow, let's start to talk about the what. the gear that I'm using to throw these baits in shallow water that make them so successful. And we're going to start with the Maribou jig. I'm going to put the Cindy rig down. We're just really going to focus on the Maribou jig for now. When you start to talk about Maribou jigs, there's a couple pretty good production models out there. This is the Beast Coast SuperFly that I've been playing with over the last year. You have the Great Lakes Finesse hair jig that is available on Tackle Warehouse. I believe Northland Tackle makes a pretty decent one. But when you start to look for those production models, what you really want to be looking for is a really good hook, like a Gamakatsu 604, a Gamakatsu 111, or an Owner 114 hook. Those are my favorite hooks when I'm looking for production model Maribou jigs, or you can tie your own. And that's what I typically do. I really like to tie my own. I can get the perfect consistency of hair to the hook that I want, to the bait keeper built into it, and I can make my own. And I have a full video breaking down how I tie my own Maribou jigs, which I'll link either up here in the corner or down here in the description for you guys to go check out. But I really like to tie my own. It takes a little bit of time, and it saves me some money as opposed to buying a bunch of Maribou jigs in the springtime. There's also some really good aftermarket, or I guess custom, options for you guys. My buddy Jeff's Jigs makes some really, really good ones, and Brian's Custom Tackle. I don't know if he's still making them, but they both make really good Maribou jigs. I don't know if Jeff ships to the US, but I'm going to leave them linked down in the description below so you can go check them out. But when you start to look for a Maribou jig, the biggest thing is the hook and the flow of the Maribou. You want to find companies that use really good Maribou and they're hand tied. When you get a good Maribou jig, you're going to notice, because you're going to see that tail sort of flow behind the bait. When you get a really good Maribou jig and you've thrown quite a few, what you're going to notice are the good ones have this natural flow to the hair when you're swimming it through the water. Okay, so when you start to see a good Maribou jig and you start tying your own or get some really good ones, it needs to have like this almost undulating flow behind that bait. They look really fluffy when you have them out of the water, but when they get wet, all that Maribou condenses down, starts to really get tight to the body. And when you start to swim that thing, you're going to notice that Maribou almost like undulate behind the bait when you're swimming it back to the boat. When you're looking for good Maribou jigs on the market, you want ones that have, no stems. You don't want them to have hard spots, and you want them to have nice, fluffy Maribou. That's going to be the biggest indication, and really hand-tied. That's going to be the biggest indication that it's going to be a good Maribou jig for you guys to fish for these smallmouth. You want it to have good flow, and the ones that I mentioned, as well as custom making your own, will help you dial in exactly the flow that you need to go and catch these fish. Now, the sizes that I'm going to throw, I keep very, 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 very incredibly simple. The only size that I throw when I'm swimming a Maribou jig, casting it out, reeling it back to the boat, is 3/32 of an ounce. I know some guys that go lighter. I know some guys that go heavier. I only throw 3/32 of an ounce. For me, that is all around best size. I can catch fish in that less than 12 foot of water zone. I can swim it down a little bit deeper, 6, 8 foot of water. I can fish it shallower, 3 to 4 foot of water, but that 3/32 of an ounce is the only size that I throw. The absolute only size that I throw. And there's really only two colors that I really throw, and that's going to be a black and purple and a brown with some sort of tan mixed into it. The reason for that brown and tan is going to be like a mayfly hatch. Otherwise, it's almost 90% of the time going to be black with a little bit of purple mixed in. It could just be straight black if that's what you prefer, but I like a little bit of purple mixed into my Maribou jig. 3/32 of an ounce, black and purple, brown and white when you're fishing around mayflies. The only two colors you need, the only size that you need to be successful. Now, one thing that I do that gives me a little bit more confidence when I'm fishing Maribou, as well as cast this bait a little bit further, because quite frankly, let's face it, 3/32 of an ounce with a fluffy bait isn't going to cast very far, is I take about a 1/4 inch section of a Berkley MaxScent hitworm or Berkley MaxScent bait, and I thread it on to that hook. The reason I believe MaxScent makes a difference, obviously, is casting distance. You can create more separation and distance between you and the bait, which I believe is a really key component of catching finicky pressured fish in shallow water. But also, I've seen it where MaxScent makes a difference. I've seen it where fish will not track a bait if it doesn't have MaxScent on it, and then you put MaxScent on there, they will literally turn around, beeline towards that bait with a little chunk of MaxScent. So for me, MaxScent is a confidence thing. This is something I truly believe in for smallmouth. So by adding that little chunk of MaxScent on the back of that Maribou jig, I have a little bit more confidence, and I believe catch more fish than guys that don't use max scent on the back of their Maribou jig. And then the rod that I use for this, which is extremely, extremely critical to be able to cast this bait and load up this bait when they bite at the end of a long cast, is the TFO Resolve 7.6 medium light. They call it fast. It's more of like a moderate fast. It bends pretty deep down into the blank. So when you're setting the hook on these really light hooks, you're not going to flex that hook at all. That 7.6 Resolve, this is probably one of the best hair jig casting rods that is on the market. This is such a phenomenal rod for this technique and really for any light bait technique. And I just really love the Resolve for Maribou jigs or Cindy rig fishing. The other key when you're fishing a Maribou jig is a lot of these bites are pressure bites. So they'll come up behind this thing when you're swimming it through the column. They just kind of get on it and you never really feel them because they get behind this thing and they catch up to it and just swim with it. So by fishing this Resolve, it's really, really sensitive, but also it will start to load up on you really quickly. That lets you feel that bite, sense that bite, lean into that fish and get them moving, and you pick up a lot of line with that long rod. And I do a sweeping hook set. I don't snap hook set. I'm not slacklining them. I'm not fishing a jig. I'll sweep hook set, kind of reel in tight and just sweep into them. In that 7.6 medium light, it will really load up deep into the blank, but drive this hook home. Another thing that I like to do to help me gain casting distance is go to a larger size reel. This is the Abu Garcia Revo MGX. It's a 3,000 size reel, but it has a really big spool on it. Lets me cast this bait a long ways. Then I have it spooled up with 8-pound test braided line to 6-pound test fluorocarbon. To me, that's really critical. The 8-pound test has a very, very thin diameter. It's a 5-carrier braid, so it's a really, really thin diameter. Then I'm fishing 6-pound test fluorocarbon that also has a really, really thin diameter. And then what I like to do is fish a really long 30-plus foot leader. The reason that I like to do that is it actually helps that bait track a lot more straight in the water. That fluorocarbon will sink in line with my Maribou jig, allowing that bait to track a lot more straight through the water column, as opposed to braid, which wants to lift up or float, which is going to cause that bait to kind of want to ride nose up on you. You can fish it on straight fluorocarbon. I got my butt kicked by Caleb a couple years ago fishing it on straight fluorocarbon, simply because you could just get that bait a little bit deeper. But for me, I get a lot more casting distance fishing it on the 8-pound test braid to 6-pound test fluorocarbon line. Now, quite frankly, both the Maribou jig and the Cindy rig are pretty much interchangeable. You can fish one or the other in the same exact situations, but there's a couple reasons that I think the Cindy rig for me has taken over, and it's a bait that I've thrown a lot more over the last season and a half than that Maribou jig. And the reason for that is simply versatility and ability to change on the fly. With a Maribou jig, like I mentioned, you're really locked into a couple colors. You have a black and you have a brown. The Cindy rig, all you have to do is change the color of the bait that you're fishing on the back, and you can really dial it into what those fish are keying on or feeding on. I don't think you have that same flexibility with a Maribou jig, and you have just so much flexibility on how you can fish a Cindy rig. Now, what a Cindy rig is really, really simple. It's just a ball head. This is an 1/8 ounce ball head jig from Great Lakes Finesse, a stealth ball head, and then their 2.75 inch drop minnow. This is a smaller version. You can now go to their 3 1/4 inch drop minnow. It's a little bit larger presentation and profile, but for me, really, that 2.75 and that ball head jig is my setup when I'm fishing a Cindy rig. I just want something that I can get a long distance cast with, again, just like the Maribou jig, and then you're just going to straight retrieve this through the water. Now, where I would pick up the Cindy rig and why I've really enjoyed the Cindy rig, I'm getting like 15 to 20 plus fish out of one of these little drop minnows, and I can change up the color based on the conditions that I'm fishing. So why would I say that? Why does that matter, right? I only fish a black or a brown, right? Well, when I fish the Cindy rig, I'll start out with a black one. Just like my hair jig, I'll start out with a black one. And if they don't want to bite the black one, or maybe the conditions seem really sunny and bright and those fish maybe don't want to track the black one, I can switch up to something like Spicy Melon, which is more of a translucent style color that these fish can't see quite as well, or maybe it blends into the water a little bit better. It looks like what they're feeding on, and I can go to catching fish. All I have to do is change the bait on the back of that little ball head jig. Or I want to go to a more natural, bait fish imitation. I can switch it up to like a Smelt, or I can switch it up to a shag color. I can switch it up to green pumpkin. I have so much more flexibility in the colors that I can mix and match with, and that's why I've really, really enjoyed fishing the Cindy rig so much as opposed to the Maribou jig. I think it's almost replaced the Maribou jig for me in a lot of situations. Where the Maribou jig might stand out and shine is when those fish are extremely, extremely pressured, very, very finicky. They've seen a lot of baits. That Maribou jig, there's something about having hair, something from a living creature in the water that has a very natural undulating action that you can't get out of the Cindy rig. This is basically a do-nothing presentation. It doesn't look like literally anything when you reel it back through the water. Swims straight, does literally nothing, but it triggers those finicky fish to bite on a Cindy rig. Maybe they would bite a Maribou jig if they won't bite a Cindy rig. But there's so much more versatility in a Cindy rig than there is that Maribou, and that's why this has really taken over for me. Now, I've fished a bunch of colors. Some of my favorites, obviously, are the black drop minnow. It's just a matte black drop minnow. I've also really liked the spicy melon color, especially when it's really bright sunny skies and that water has that greenish tint to it. This spicy melon color has caught me a bunch of big fish, especially in the pre-spawn. And then a color that I've been playing with quite a bit is more of a Smelt style color or a two-tone dual injection. And this is their Goby color. They have Smelt color, they have matte 309, basically just a bait fish imitation when those fish get really keyed into bait fish in the water. They have a watermelon pearl color, which is really cool color too. Looks just like a perch on the back of a on the back of a green pumpkin ball head. And it just looks like what those fish are keying on. And like I mentioned, you can really mix and match the color of the drop minnow to that ball head. And it's just so much more versatile and quick to change than the Maribou jig. Basically interchangeable, can fish in the same situations. Maybe there's a time and place where the Maribou jig outfishes a Cindy or vice versa, but they're pretty much interchangeable based on what you want to throw. So we've talked about the when, we've talked about the gear. Now let's talk about the how you fish this and what you're going to be looking for in the water to have success with these techniques. Now for me, when I'm fishing in shallow water, the biggest key is I am looking for something isolated, looking for something different, looking for an area for these fish to ambush bait or set up to spawn. Okay, so I am basically looking for an isolated piece of cover. That could be a laydown, that could be a boulder, that could be a small rock, that could be a cinder block that someone dropped on the bottom. I'm looking for something super isolated on the bottom in these shallow water zones where these fish are going to hang out. Smallmouth are opportunistic feeders. They're looking for an ambush point to get behind, some shade, some area to kind of get in and get around where they can feed effectively. Another great area that a lot of people overlook this time of year is grass edges. Smallmouth bass typically don't want to hang out in the grass itself, but I've caught a lot of big fish hanging around these, tufts of grass in the water. They'll hang out around the sides of that grass, and you wind that little Cindy rig by it. They'll come up out from that grass, or I guess next to the grass, and smoke that Cindy rig. One of the best bites I ever got on with a Maribou jig was fishing off of a grass ledge. You basically cast it up past the grass flat. You brought it off the other side of it where it started to drop off into deeper water, and you could almost call your shots because you'd see these little points and turns in the bottom, turns in the grass, and these fish were sitting on that grass edge, coming up feeding on that Maribou jig as you brought it past that. That's actually where Caleb kicked my butt fishing it on Fluorocarbon. He could get that bait just slightly closer to the grass, and those fish would come up and eat his bait before they ate mine. Another phenomenal spot that's not so much cover related is small changes in the structure that you're fishing. When I say structure, I'm talking the contour lines. Small changes in the contour lines of the areas that you're fishing, especially during the pre-spawn when these fish are getting up the stage to spawn. If you're fishing down a break, don't just fish the flattest sections of the break where it drops off quickly. Look for where there's changes in that break. Maybe it flattens out a little bit, where those contour lines start to spread out. Look for the small turns or points, or look for areas where maybe those contour lines get a little bit closer together. There's a steeper break. These changes in those contour lines, these small micro changes, these inside turns, these small differences can make the difference in finding a big pot of fish and not catching any at all. Now, the way that I'm fishing this is very, very, very simple. The reason I say that is because it is a simple cast and wind retrieve. All you have to do is cast that bait out there, let it hit the water, let it sink for a few seconds, and use a super slow, steady retrieve and reel it all the way back to the boat. Now, when I say super slow and steady, I'm not talking like you want to vary that retrieve, you want to give it some changes or pulse. I am using the most bare minimum, flat, standard, basic turn my handle as slow as I can all the way back to the boat. See if a fish is tracking it. Reel that bait all the way back, not changing the retrieve. This is the only bait that I don't change the retrieve when I'm fishing this. There's something about fishing a Cindy rig, fishing a Maribou jig. If you've done it enough, you'll see fish that will track that Maribou jig for 20, 30, 40 feet before they actually make the decision to commit to that bait, and you won't change anything about that retrieve. But there's something about that super slow, steady, methodical retrieve that will trigger way more bites than the guys that are trying to, modify the retrieve, flare the reel handle or shake their rod. These fish that are keying in on these super finesse presentations, they don't want something that's acting crazy in the water. They just want a super natural retrieve, a super unsuspecting bait to come up and eat. I've seen it enough times. You'll get a big smallmouth 5-6 pounder, follow all the way to the boat, just not commit, and you go to change the reel handle or flare the retrieve or drop that bait, and that fish will zip away from the boat. Just continue on that retrieve, and when that fish decides he wants to turn away because he sees it, figure out which direction he's going, cast it back out there, and he'll either come back and eat it or he'll follow back to the boat again. It is not something that's really critically crazy that you need to get that fish to eat that bait the very first time. So really, these are very, very simple approaches. Cindy rig and Maribou jig, you cast that bait out, you're targeting isolated pieces of cover or isolated bottom composition changes or isolated contour changes on the bottom, and you're just using a slow, steady, methodical retrieve back to the boat to trick these fish to bite. It's a very, very easy approach. Maybe gets overthought a little bit, but it is such a deadly approach when these fish get in those shallow water zones. So hopefully you guys learned something about fishing a Maribou jig. Hopefully you guys learned something about fishing a Cindy rig that will help you go out and have success this spring. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already. Maybe go check this video or here where I talk about fishing shallow water and my 3 keys to shallow water fishing to help me catch more and bigger bass. Hit that button right there if you're not already subscribed. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue passion.